Okay, friends, video 2. Let's hope it's only 2 and not 3, right? Let's try to get this done. Video 2, let's close up shop on the Odyssey. Okay, so as you noticed, so most of the questions I asked you in this unit were intended to try to get you to notice these really important narrative devices, these different things which cue you into how the story is being told, not just what is being told. And also to kind of ask you some sort of bigger synthetic questions to ask you to make relationships between what you know from your own, schemata, we call it, right? The things that you know, your background, your experiences, so on and so forth, to connect big things that you think about with big issues that are already, really visible even from the beginning of the Odyssey and become more visible as you move through it, right? Big things about human condition stuff, right, guys? Like how do we treat strangers, right? What does loyalty mean? What's it mean to be a good leader, right? So they're sort of like big human questions that I've been asking you so that you have a place to enter into the text, but also some big questions that are really related again to this idea of how do we read text, not just looking for the themes and what is in it, but how is it written and who wrote it and what does that mean? And so I asked you this really big question, like, we don't really know who Homer was. We don't know if Homer was a real person. We don't know if this entire text was composed by one person, we especially don't know if it was one person named Homer. There's the fun theory that maybe Homer was a woman because, or at least the Homer who wrote this, not the Homer who wrote the Iliad, but the Homer who wrote the Odyssey was a woman because it's so rare to see women, represented so, in such a complex manner. And I ask you the question, does it even matter? And that might seem like a really rhetorical question, but that's actually a big question when it comes to how do we interpret text from the perspective of literary criticism. Because there are a lot of people who are, and some of you know this term, like his new historicist, right, who want to contextualize everything as written in its time period by the person who wrote it, and it matters, if you're reading about what am I thinking of? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because Nurse Ratched came up on my I think Netflix the other day. If you're reading the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, does it matter that it was written by somebody who has never been in a mental hospital, so on and so forth? You kind of remove that question altogether when you say we don't even know who it was. It's not actually possible for the interpretation of this text to be influenced by any real intentions of an author, because we don't have those intentions. The best we can do is sort of reconstruct what intentions of any sort of person, oral storyteller of that time may have been. It's tricky business, right? And so this idea of does it matter who wrote a text really just brings up different ways to approach interpreting a text. Not saying that one is right, not saying that one is wrong, but it's something I want you to learn to think about, especially when you're approaching texts that are from a different culture, because it is getting to understand the author better and their situation is one of those windows into how might we be able to understand this text that is foreign and distant to me, is maybe through understanding better the social context of the person who wrote it. We'll get there a little bit when we get to the adaptations, because the adaptations are kind of easier for us to, at least we're going to look at in class, kind of easier for us to suss out some motivation or intentions. That's a word that my particular style of criticism is not really fond of, but like the intentions of authors. When we're talking about adaptations, like the author intended to rewrite this. What's the rhetorical effect of that rewriting? Okay, we can sort of make some easier assumptions about that. And then we kind of work a little backwards and say like, okay, what was Margaret Atwood's intention in the Penelopiad? And if we know her as a feminist writer, if we've read her other books, that might help us to enter into, the motivation for this adaptation. So I'm kind of giving you a warning here, guys, right? That there's no one right and wrong. There's no one right way to interpret a text. And that's absolutely one of the things that I want you to take out of this class. These adaptations that we focus on basically the entire semester, the whole idea is they are interpretations of the text that they interpret. And the next unit we're moving on to is about translations of the Arabian Nights. Every translation is an interpretation of the text that it translates. You have to make very purposeful decisions in choosing what words that you use to replace the others with. And so you have to interpret the text as you prepare a translation. And you interpret a text as you create an adaptation of it or an extension of it or make allusion to it. There's one really, very striking comment on the discussion board about the Penelopiad disrupting the Odyssey, which I love. I love that term. It's one of my favorite terms about what feminist, rewritings can do, is to disrupt the narrative, right? Just disrupt the male dominant narrative, right? So that's all kind of wrapped up. Sorry, there's a big thing, like, does it matter who wrote it? Does it matter who wrote the Odyssey? Does it matter who writes any given text? For one particular kind of reading, for many kinds of readings, it does really matter. But for others, it doesn't. What matters is what the audience gets out of the text. And that sort of leads us to the idea of, finally getting to the Damrosch chapter. You're going to have a Damrosch chapter for each one of your major units. This one about, reading across time involves the notion of reading backwards and reading forwards. So I like to sort of start with the idea of, that two-way, system there. When we read forwards from the Odyssey, we are, when we in 2020 in a pandemic, when we read the Odyssey, we are not just reading the Odyssey. We are reading everything that has been written about the Odyssey, every adaptation to allusion, so on and so forth, every different interpretation of it, all the different translations of it, because it has entered social consciousness in a way. You had at least every one of you expressed some familiarity with an aspect of the Odyssey, if not the actual text itself, right? So we our reading of the Odyssey is read forward from that original because, especially because it is, once again, it's a translation, so it's therefore already interpreted for us. And when Wilson has interpreted to translate it for us, she has in the back of her mind all of her previous experience and all really the literary traditions experience with the Odyssey and the way it's been interpreted and retold already. But we're also reading, backwards to the Odyssey in a sense, which means we have to be very careful about how much of ourselves and our contemporary expectations, especially our contemporary ethical systems, right? Our notions of what's right and wrong. Everybody gets stuck up on Odysseus' infidelity. Trust me, I've been teaching this for a long time, right? Everybody gets stuck there. But we are reading backwards from 2020 to a classical Greek text. And this goes back to this idea of if you focus on the narrative devices and you focus on how the text is constructed, you focus on how it tells you what it's telling you rather than always on what it's telling you, it's a little easier to disengage when you read backwards, right? And to see how is this world constructed? What is this world? And how can I read it for what it is? That being said, it's critical for us to read, also read ourselves into distant text. I said old. I was going to say old. Let's just say old. Let's just say it. They're old, y'all. They're old. It's critical for ourselves to read our contemporary selves into old texts because it teaches us about ourselves in the contrast, right? So this is how we read backwards and we read forwards. We're always, in a way, an author or at least a scribe, right? put it down on paper at some point, let's say, but an author or a storyteller created a story and they gave it some meaning, some of its meaning, but the rest of the meaning comes from its audience. And the Odyssey had a contemporary audience, but it's had audiences ever since. And each audience, each one person, each, as Calvino pointed out in one of those essays that I gave you at the very beginning, even each time the same one person reads, they're a different audience for a text. And so the meaning changes because it's a collaboration between the sort of creator and the receiver, right? Together, they kind of co-create the meaning. So that means that reading backwards and reading forwards is really a collaborative process. And so some of the adaptations that you read are part of, they were part of the kind of like collective consciousness, and, Wilson's translation, Dante and Tennyson and, even Atwood and Barth, existed before her translation. So they're part of it in the sense of they may have informed the way that she interpreted it. They weren't part of your knowledge of it necessarily before, but they are now. So now you can not only read backwards to the Odyssey in its original context, but you can also read backwards to the Odyssey before you read any adaptations of it. So you had knowledge of it then, and your knowledge of it has changed because you've read forward into these extensions, allusions, adaptations. So I wanted to make sure to clarify a couple things about those adaptations. Alphabetically, we have Atwood. Atwood is considered to be an adaptation because it tells the same story, but it tells it from a very, very different perspective, right? From Penelope's perspective. It's a very interesting text because it has a lot of different, it's kind of we call it a postmodern pastiche. It's made up of different kinds of texts, and some of them are first person, some of them are third person, so on and so forth. The entire book itself, it's called a novel, but when you have this sort of mishmash of different genres all within one book together, it doesn't look like your classic novel, your traditional novel. But in any case, so it is feminist disruption, right, of the Odyssey, and this idea that the women's voices really aren't heard. There are some points which we are given a perspective on Penelope, but it is not Penelope's perspective. And we certainly are not given the perspective of the slave women, right, who are murdered, right? And so it's this idea which is part of the sort of feminist literary project, which is to reclaim women's voices. And so this is this idea of telling an aspect of the story which is not revealed in the source text. That's one kind of adaptation. And so by creating a different perspective on the Odyssey itself, it's like interpreting the Odyssey in a way. You have to express an interpretation in order to do this kind of adaptation. But it's not as additive as John Barth's text is, right? Because it doesn't give you any more story. It doesn't create anything new. It just tells you a different perspective on what has already been told. Barth gives you a different perspective on what's been told. He tells you some details about what's happening with Penelope when she ain't really by herself for the 10 years it takes him to be at war and the 10 years it takes him to get back. Not at all. And gives you some really interesting ideas about, when he comes home, it's been 20 years since they've been apart from each other. You really think that they're going to hang out together? John Barth didn't think so. So I don't want to spoil the details for anybody who really wants to read it. It is one of my favorite books. I actually wrote an article about this book. So if you're into it, you can Google it and you can read the article. Don't have to. It's totally fine. But yeah, it's an article that came out of my dissertation. So that means it's near and dear to my heart. But it's an adaptation, but it's also a continuation. It gives you what's sort of, a lot of what happens after the original story ends. And so that kind of tells you a lot about, you know, what is it about, like, why would you retell a story but then add more things to it, right? And what is, you know, arguably so fascinating to Barth, and this whole reason he wants to continue the story, is because the Odyssey is a story about storytelling. The whole entire thing is like, you know, invocation to the muses, let me tell you a story about this man. Odysseus is the classic storyteller himself, right? Which we see in you know, Alcynus's court, so on and so forth. But like, you know, it is a story about how we tell stories and about why they're so effective. And that's something that the Tidewater Tales as a book is about. And so John Barth actually extends a number of different stories: Don Quixote, Scheherazade, which you guys are coming up to in Arabian Nights, and Odysseus and Penelope and Nausicaa. And so, you know, I'm excited because we're headed into the Arabian Nights, which is another book about storytelling. It's even clearer in the Arabian Nights. This idea of using narrative devices to establish a world, to connect with your reader, to make very explicit points, and really to argue that storytelling is life. Storytelling is how we know and create the world, right? Obviously, you guys, I'm all excited about this stuff. So, and then I just wanted to make really clear with the third adaptation that I gave you guys. This is the closest to what when we say an adaptation, we often mean, right? So Atwood gives you a different perspective and Barth gives you a continuation. But really what Zimmerman is doing is giving you the same story, different package. And it's a play as opposed to an epic poem. And so the idea there was I was hoping you would notice that the context and the medium changes the way that the story is told. That you can present primarily the same story and just change the package, and that will have a different meaning. You know, we can't have an omniscient narrator play. We have to have characters acting things out. So we have to kind of create, you know, sort of a narrator to get to the inner workings of things and to some of the explanations of stuff that a third person omniscient narrator would give us. So that's sort of thrown in there just as an, you know, when we talk about adaptation, oftentimes we're just talking about the same story, different package. So, all right, I'm getting long. I'm going to stop. I should have stopped. Should have cut this up. But anyways, we're going to make a segue into the Arabian Nights. One of the things I asked you about as far as the Odyssey was to pay attention to the different translations and what they meant. And you can see that that translation is everything. It can change the meaning dramatically. So we're going to work on that for the next unit. So thank you for reading across time with me. And I'll try to come back to you hopefully before we actually close up that unit, but at the very least, we'll do a unit wrap up for that too. Thanks, you guys.